Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, in our ongoing study in Christian apologetics. We're taking a look at a Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. We're going to take a look at chapters 11 and 12, and it will take a look at cumulative evidence. We want to look at pages 159 to 213 on the dating of the Gospels, internal corroboration and external corroboration of the Gospels. Let's begin with block 1. Let's take a look at the dating of the Gospels. Wallace tells us that we ask the question, are the Gospels true eyewitness accounts or late 2nd century documents? He says there's a great deal of circumstantial evidence that supports an early date for the Gospels, because they fail to describe the destruction of the temple in AD 70. There's no mention of the 3-year siege of Jerusalem by Titus from 67 to 70. The Gospel of Luke says nothing about the death of Paul or Peter, AD 64 and 65, or the death of James the Just in 62. We know that Luke's Gospel was written prior to the book of Acts. And Paul quotes Luke's Gospel in his letter to Timothy, which has a date of AD 63 or 64. The earliest church leaders were familiar with 1 Timothy at a very early date. And throughout the book of Romans, dated AD 50, Paul frequently quotes and accepts the Gospels. 1 Corinthians 15, which is very early, is also a passage that presents a view consistent with the Gospels. Galatians, dated in the 50s or 60s, describes Paul's interaction with Peter and James. That's where he learned about the Gospel accounts within 5 years of the crucifixion. Now from here, let's take a look at quotations pointing backward. Paul quoted Luke's Gospel in his letter to the Corinthians. His account of the Lord's Supper is very similar to Luke's. The phrase, "do this in remembrance of me," is taken from Luke. Luke quoted Mark and Matthew frequently. Luke admits he is not an eyewitness, he is a historian. Luke actually takes 350 verses from Mark, 250 verses from Matthew. Mark's Gospel is the earliest account. It is brief and focused. It has a sense of urgency because he felt that Jesus would return very soon. Mark penned Simon Peter's experiences. And this Gospel is not concerned with order of events. Also, Mark protects individuals by leaving out their names. Doing so, says he's trying to prevent them from being targeted by Jewish and Roman leadership, meaning that they are still alive. Therefore, Wallace says we end up with the following timeline. Mark is written between 45 and 50. Luke is written between 50 and 53. Paul quotes Luke in 53 to 57. Acts was written 57 to 60. The death of James, Peter, and Paul, 61 to 65. Siege of Jerusalem, 67 to 70. Destruction of the temple, AD 70. So, Wallace posits early dates for the Gospels, not late 2nd century, but early dates for the Gospels. The question comes up, who was Theophilus in Luke's introduction? Luke uses the term most excellent Theophilus. He used most excellent for Roman officials, therefore he may have been a Roman official of some sort, a short term, because he's not addressed that way in the book of Acts. But he could have been a Jewish leader in the 1st century because Luke fails to mention Caiaphas' role in the crucifixion, and Caiaphas was brother-in-law to Theophilus Ananus. Personally, I side with the view that Theophilus was a Jewish leader related to Caiaphas. Now from here we want to take a look at, from block 1 we do realize that Wallace posits early dates for the Gospels. He rejects the notion that the Gospels are late 2nd century documents. They are 1st century eyewitness documents. He also says that he's going to reinforce this position by offering internal corroboration and external corroboration, which we will take a look at next. But his initial thesis in block 1 is to give the Gospels an early date, 1st century, very early date. And he uses historical events to come to that conclusion. The fact that certain deaths were not mentioned, that the destruction of the temple was not mentioned. Let's move on to block 2. Let's take a look at internal corroboration. Wallace tells us each writer provides support for the others. There is an interdependence between the gospel accounts. There are over 40 examples of this interdependence. He gives us just a few. The calling of the disciples. Matthew's account simply says, Jesus simply says, "Follow me," and the disciples respond. That doesn't really make sense, but Luke supplies the missing details. In Luke, the disciples first hear Jesus preach. So Luke provides the additional details. Now the striking of Jesus' examination before Caiaphas. In Matthew 26 we read, "Prophesy to us, who hit you?" Again, from this account, it really doesn't make sense because they're standing right there with Jesus. But in Luke 22, we receive the missing data that Jesus was blindfolded. One that's really interesting is the feeding of the 5,000. In Mark 6, the people were coming and going even before Jesus became the central focus. Why is that the case? In John 6, he supplies the additional data that the people searched out Jesus because of the healings he was performing. And it was nearly Passover when crowds began to gather. But John also mentions Philip and Andrew by name in his account. Why? Luke provides the additional data that Jesus first withdrew to the city of Bethsaida prior to this event. Philip and Andrew were both from Bethsaida. Therefore, it's logical they would be addressed concerning the availability of food. They were from Bethsaida. They were familiar with Bethsaida. Now, Wallace also says names were referenced correctly by the Gospel writers. The Gospels were written from specific locations. Mark from Rome, Matthew from Judea, Luke from Antioch, John from Ephesus in Asia Minor. The popular names found in the Gospels are the most popular names found in 1st century Palestine. It supports eyewitness familiarity. They also added descriptors to common names, further supplying eyewitness familiarity. Conclusion: therefore the Gospels are authentic and corroborated by internal considerations, says Wallace. They are corroborated by internal considerations. But he doesn't leave it there. He wants to look at external corroboration as well. What about when we go outside the Gospels and look at secular historical documents? So let's go to block 3. Let's take a look at external secular documents. We begin with Josephus. From his writing we read that Jesus lived, was wise and virtuous, and demonstrated power, and was condemned and crucified under Pilate, and he was believed to be the Messiah. Now Thallus, he was a Samaritan historian. He wrote a 3-volume history only 20 years after the crucifixion. Here's what's interesting. He chronicled the crucifixion and offered an explanation for the darkness from 12 to 3 p.m. He said it appears as an eclipse of the sun. Tacitus was an ancient historian, a senator under Vespasian, and a proconsul of Asia. He describes the presence of Christians in Rome. He testified that Jesus lived and was crucified by Pilate. Now Mara bar Serapion, he was a Syrian philosopher. In a writing to encourage his son, he compared the life of Jesus to philosophers who were persecuted for their ideas. He said that the dispersion of the Jews was punishment for their execution of Jesus. For him, Jesus was wise, influential, and executed for his beliefs. Phlegon wrote a history in 140 AD. He also mentioned the darkness at Jesus' crucifixion. He says there was a full eclipse of the sun from 12 to 3 p.m. Along with earthquakes, he testified that Jesus was crucified under the reign of Tiberius Caesar. And we know that Tiberius did reign at that time, and then he was murdered by his nephew Caligula, and Caligula became the first emperor after the resurrection of Christ. But at the time, Tiberius Caesar was the reigning emperor. Now, the archaeology in Luke, there is corroboration of Quirinius as governor at the time of the census recorded by Luke. An inscription bearing Lysanias by name as the tetrarch of Abila was also recorded by Luke. Also, Luke accurately recorded the government in 1st century Palestine under Roman rule. Now, the pool of Siloam in John 9 was a place of ceremonial cleansing. It actually was discovered in the old city of David in 2004. They actually found it in the old city of David. Pontius Pilate in 1961, a piece of limestone was discovered with the inscription of Pilate's name. There is external corroboration of the gospel accounts as well. So Wallace is telling us that although there is from secular and liberal skeptics, there's a great deal of documentation saying the Gospels are late 2nd century documents. For Wallace, the evidence does not support that conclusion. The evidence on the dating of the Gospels points to early dates. Mark around 45 to 50, Luke around 50 to 53. John, of course, is late 1st century, around AD 95. Mark's the earliest. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all used Mark for their Gospels and the Q document, which was a document of the sayings of Jesus. But Matthew used Mark and Q, Luke used Mark and Q, and Mark did use Q. There was a sayings document in early 1st century Christianity. But Mark is the earliest, which is the account penned by Mark of Simon Peter. And then Matthew and Luke used Mark. John is the latest, around AD 95. The Gospels were circulated at that time, the prior Gospels. But John's is not considered a synoptic Gospel like Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But all of them are given 1st century dates by Wallace, and then he further substantiates that with internal corroboration because the Gospels are interdependent. Details are filled in because remember he said that eyewitness accounts are always accounts from a specific perspective, Therefore, you should find additional details and different details from different perspectives. The Gospels are interdependent. External corroboration comes through a number of historians, secular historians. Josephus, Thallus, Tacitus, a Syrian philosopher, Phlegon, and there have been archaeology discoveries as well. So we get a great look at the dating of the Gospels and internal, external corroboration of the Gospels. That's going to wrap up chapters 11 and 12. It'll be pages 159 to 213. We'll pick up in chapter 13 next.